One of the questions that sort of come to me, or naturally come up, is so how do Japanese teachers develop their craft of teaching? Right? And the short answer is, well, through lesson study. So lesson study is a professional development activity long favored by Japanese teachers. And some Japanese would say that they have been practicing lesson study for over 100 years. Which is, I mean, if you think about it, it seems like it's a long time, but well, it is. But Japan's education system was very different before their Meiji Revolution time. Back then, with with shoguns and samurais, those days, the education system was much more like independent, individual tutoring type of situations. We didn't have schools. Right? So, but with the change of the government political systems, and we established schools, now we have to actually teach students in groups. And that required different ways of thinking about teaching and learning. And through that process, they began to develop this idea of lesson study, some of which apparently, actually, the idea came from the United States, surprisingly. I don't know, this is one of the common phenomena in the US, that we develop some ideas, but we don't stick with it. And we just try to keep moving on to something else. And now I'm wearing the Japanese hat and says, so make a stereotype about Japanese people. As the Japanese people often say, whenever something comes in from the West, it must be good. So if it doesn't work, we must have done something wrong, so we have to figure out, we have to keep tinkering it to make sure it works. Right? We go through that process. But anyway, so the centerpiece of this activity called lesson study is the observation and discussion of carefully designed research lesson. And what makes lesson study unique, and some of these ideas are discussed by various researchers who have been looking at lesson study, like Catherine Lewis, Makoto Yoshida. But one of the things about the lesson studies is really teacher-centered and teacher-focused, the teacher-driven. And it focuses on students' learning, and it's ongoing, and it's really a long-term process. It's a continuous process. And it's often done in a collaborative manner. So there's some pictures from Japan, not quite sure how well you can see, but these are during the public research lessons. So you see all these people observing. There's some people here, and they take very careful notes during the lesson. This particular picture was taken after the lessons, and all these teachers who observed the lesson was looking at what's left on the whiteboard. Now that might sound a little strange. I don't know how Irish math teachers teach mathematics, but in Japan, the math teachers try to teach the lesson in such a way that at the end of the lesson, you have a board full, but try not to erase anything. So you can actually see the whole lesson recorded on the board. So they are actually looking at that board and thinking about what happened in the lesson. Now that in itself is something that you might want to think about. Right? If you cannot erase the board, what would you write? Where would you write it? How would you highlight it? Right? That's really difficult questions to think about. Right? So lesson study. In lesson study, teachers learning from each other, not from so-called experts. Like in the US, we have the expression that says, somebody from out of town with a briefcase. Right? I don't know if you have some equivalent phrase in the Irish community, but teachers really learning from each other, teachers learning to teach through teaching and reflecting on own teaching. Now, own teaching might involve you yourself, or it could be your colleagues watching the colleagues teach. And the basic cycle lesson study, you start with a challenge or issues that you're dealing with. Why can't my students make sense of this concept? I've tried so many different things, and they still seem to have problems. Right? Start with a problem. Then teachers will examine the teaching materials. This is the process called Kyōzai Kenkyu. Well, I'll talk with you a little bit later. And they collaboratively develop a lesson plan based on the study of the teaching material. And this lesson plan is basically a proposal on how to tackle the challenge or the issue. So again, this is talking about thinking about mathematics teacher as a researcher, or mathematics teaching as research. You have a problem. Here's a puzzle. So you create a possible solution. Now you're going to test this out and examine it. Right? So you teach the lesson and then critically discuss the research lesson by everyone who observed the lesson. Right? And then reflect and summarize the learning that took place, the teacher's learning that took place. And here's the sort of more pictorial way of representing the whole process. And this is really based on, in Japan there are 3 or 4 different types of lesson study practiced, but this is based on sort of a school-based lesson study. So this whole lesson study group is oftentimes the entire school. And then, but even though the entire school have 25, 30 teachers involved, at some point collaboration is good, but when you try to develop something, trying to develop a lesson plan with 30 teachers is not going to work too well. Right? So they oftentimes end up in smaller lessons planning group. And this group will engage in the research and materials and develop the lesson plan, then teach the lesson, and then post-lesson discussion, and then summarize the lesson learning, and then they go on to develop another lesson plan. But these other teachers in the lesson study group would also observe the research lesson and engage in the post-lesson discussions. And many of the school-based lesson study cycle would just include this part of the pictures, but once in a while they would actually have a lesson study open house where they actually invite other teachers from the same school district or teachers from other school district to come observe. And they observe the lessons and engage in post-lesson discussion. And those teachers might go back and revise the lesson plan and examine in their own classrooms. Well, sometimes they might actually teach the lesson plan as they were designed and see its effect in their own classrooms. So they're engaged in, I guess in science experiments, we call them replications. Right? They do some kind of replication research. And all of this leads to the new idea for teaching and learning. And so it's important to keep in mind that lesson studies, this public lesson, is not a demonstration lesson. Okay? It's not a model lesson. And it's really, the whole process is the problem solving. Start with a problem, develop a possible plan, implement the plan, and look back. And if you look at these 4 steps, right, and for those of you who are familiar with Polyé would know that those are the 4 steps of problem solving Polyé talks about. Right? So this lesson study is really this kind of problem-solving activities for the teachers, mathematics teachers, and it's not necessarily just for mathematics teachers. In Japan, they do this with every subject matters, including, as strange as it may sound, they actually have lesson study on lunch, because in Japanese teachers, more with elementary schools, but Japanese teachers, every minute the students spend in school is part of education experience, and teachers are responsible. And the school lunch period should also be an educational time. And so they actually think about how to make that a productive time, and by conducting lesson study. Right? So the Kyōzai Kenkyu, that's really the key, or one of the key components of the lesson studies. And this basically the Chinese characters. We have Japanese letters as well, but we also adopted many Chinese characters. We pronounce it in Japanese way, so the Chinese people would not be able to understand what we're saying. But it's not like we're trying to hide anything from them. But these are the letters. And each letter means something. This first letter, pronounced kyo, is to teach or to instruct. The second letter, zai, means raw materials. And kenkyu, these 2 letters, means to study or to research. I think the research is probably more literal translation than study. So Kyōzai Kenkyu is the study of raw materials for teaching. And oftentimes the raw materials for teaching involves, but it goes beyond textbooks and whatever the curriculum materials. Okay. But oftentimes when Japanese teachers engage in Kyōzai Kenkyu, they would go and look at, in Japan they have the National Course of Study, the national standards. and they look at the standards. Okay, what's this standard about? They examine that, and then examine textbook and says, okay, how is the textbook trying to address this particular standard? So during the Kyōzai Kenkyu, teachers ask different kinds of questions. So one of the questions might be, well, so what do we want students to understand? Studying concept X. Let's say formula for the area of triangles and parallelograms, which is sort of a borderline elementary, secondary. I think where I am in Georgia, when I first moved to Georgia, the area of parallelograms and triangle was actually in grade 5, which meant about 10, 11 years old. And now with this new set of standards called Common Core State Standards, the area of triangles and parallelograms moved up to grade 7, which is 13 years old. So this particular topic is really on the fence, and depending on which revisions you're looking at, sometimes it might fall on the elementary side, sometimes it might fall on the secondary side. Where does this fit in the Irish standard? I think it was in junior cycles still, right? So if you're looking at the formula, right, we probably are interested in more than just students being able to recite or state area formula, right? I have given some problems to my students who are, many of them are basically looking for becoming elementary school teachers. And I asked the problems, and I said, give some problems to find the area of this shape as a pretest or something. Many of them can't solve the problem, but many of them voluntarily write on this sheet of paper, says A equal 1/2 BH. But they have no idea what that means, right? So these students can recite the formula, but I think we want something more than just being able to recite, right? So if you're looking at the triangle formula, it says, well, it would be nice if they understand where that divide by 2 comes from, and triangles as well as trapezoids, what you call trapezium, right? I'm still not quite sure about what trapezium and what's not trapezium, but what is the height? And oftentimes the difficulty with the formulas, with the parallelograms and triangles, or even the trapezoid, is understanding what height is about. And all these kind of things, we want them to be able to explain. Right? We definitely want them to be able to use formulas, but not just simply to find the area, but perhaps to develop the further formulas. Once they learn about the formula for area of parallelograms, can they use that in trying to figure out developing new formula for some other shapes? Those are the kind of things we want. And that's what we want students to understand. And then we can start thinking about, well, how can students develop the goal understanding? Okay. What do students already know? How do students need to understand this particular idea? So how do they need to understand this idea so that they can use it in their next year's study or 2 years down the road? And teachers are often, they often agree that we need to start with where students are, or look at what students bring with. But we don't often look at this, so now what do you want them to take it with them so that they can use with the next grade? Right? But that's something also important to look at, not just simply looking at where they came from, but where they are going and how do they need this idea to be successful later. Right? They might look at how this particular topic is treated in different curriculum materials. Right? So if you look at the scope and sequence of typical area discussion, usually, obviously, I haven't seen any countries, any curriculum, which doesn't start the discussion of area with rectangles and squares. Right? You probably start with there. Right? But after that, I think in Japan there are 2 possible routes if you look at the textbooks. Some of them would actually look at the triangles first, especially the right triangles first, right? Then the general triangles, and then go to parallelogram. Others will look at the parallelogram first, and then go to triangles, and then trapezoid and circles eventually. Which way do you do? Well, does it matter? Right? This is actually one of the problems. I think it's not quite settled in Japan either, because the 2 of the most widely used textbook series in Japan, one used the triangle first approach, and the other uses the parallelogram first approach. And so oftentimes the lesson study is done on this particular topic, and the teachers are trying to make a case which is better. Right? But part of the questions that you might ask during the Kyōzai Kenkyu is what are the advantages and disadvantages of these approaches? Is it better to do triangle first or parallelogram first? Right? And then they should start thinking about, well, so how can we teach this particular topic effectively? And you might think about what are some of the misunderstandings that students often make, or errors. What tools or manipulators can students use to develop their understanding? And all of these kind of discussion eventually lead to this developing of the learning task or the lesson plans. And the Japanese teachers would do this and they have this saying, right? To teach one, you need to learn 10. Right? So if you want to teach something, you have to learn a whole lot more than that. Okay. But then there's an important corollary that comes after this one. But once you learn 10, you must discard 9 because you only have time enough to teach 1. And that's something that we need to keep in mind. Sometimes when you start doing the research, you start learning so many interesting things. You learn 10 and you want to teach 10. But if you keep doing that, how many days do you go to school in Ireland? About 180 days, the same as the US? You have only 180 days. You have to teach 1. If you teach 1 and learn 10 and you start teaching 10, you're not going to have enough time. Right? So, but when you discard 9, the one that you're left with is going to be much, much better than the one you start with. Right? And so that's the reason the Japanese teachers just go through this Kyōzai Kenkyu. So why lesson study? Sugiyama, the Professor Sugiyama is a very well-known Japanese math educator who recently retired. But he often talks about 3 levels of mathematics teaching. And level 1 is the teachers who can tell students important basic ideas of mathematics, such as facts, concepts, and procedures. I hope it doesn't happen in Ireland, but sometimes in the US, and unfortunately it's becoming a little bit more common in Japan too, but people are very, very critical of teachers. And they often make, they often make statements like those who can do and those who can't teach. Right? And says anybody can teach. Right? What they don't realize is that teaching they're looking at is this level 1 teaching. That anybody can do. You just need a good textbook or good resources. Just show the kids and demonstrate how to do something. Japanese would not consider this as a professional teaching. This is what parents and siblings can do. Okay? This is what people off the street can do. But it's not professional teaching. Okay? Level 2 teaching, according to Sugiyama, is the teachers who can explain the meaning and reasons of the important basic ideas of mathematics in order for students to understand them. So now teachers can actually explain why this works. They can explain how a formula for the area of a triangle is derived, or how the quadratic formula is derived and why it works. So the teachers who can actually explain. And the Japanese teacher would say this is the sort of basic beginning level of the professional teaching. The level 3 teaching, the teachers who can provide students opportunities to understand these basic ideas and support their learning so that the students become independent learners. It's really developing the autonomous learners. And it's this emphasis on autonomy, that what the Polye talked about, independent work. Right? And this is the level that the Japanese teachers strive for. Okay. Knowing the content of what's written in the textbooks is the most important foundation to be a reasonably good teacher, level 2 teacher. Okay. However, that's not enough to be an effective level 3 teacher. I work in the Department of Mathematics and Statistics, so I have a lot of colleagues who have doctorates in mathematics and statistics, so they know a lot about the foundation part of mathematics. I think you're videotaping, but I think they're not going to see it. It's okay to see it. So let's look back in your own college days, right? The mathematics teachers. If that's enough to be good level 3 teachers, mathematics department should be filled with exemplary teachers, right? Right? All of your mathematics professors were wonderful teachers, right? So let's just stop there. So teaching through problem solving is a type of this level 3 teaching. And this is something that the Japanese teachers strive toward throughout their career. And I haven't yet met a Japanese teacher who says, well, I'm a level 3 teacher. Some of them might say, well, I can do level 3 teaching more often now than when I first started out, or even after 10 years of teaching. It seems to happen more often. I always try to do it, but it doesn't always happen. Right? So they keep working on. So, no teacher education program can produce level 3 teachers. Right? All teachers, prospective, novice, or experienced, need ongoing opportunities to continue growing toward level 3 teaching throughout their careers. Okay? And Nakihiko Takahashi is another colleague I often work with. He talks about 2 phases, or the 2 types of professional learning. And phase 1, according to his way of thinking about, phase 1 professional learning is focusing on developing knowledge base for teaching mathematics, which may involve the mathematics content knowledge, about something about pedagogy, something about psychology, something about students. Right? But he says phase 2 learning is really the professional learning that focused on developing expertise for teaching mathematics. Phase 1 knowledge might allow you to develop a good lesson plan. But developing a lesson plan and actually teaching a lesson the way you envision is different. There is something about expertise of mathematics teaching that is required to make that lesson happen. In the US, the lesson study was introduced somewhere around 1999, year 2000. There are several different lesson study organizations. The Chicago Lesson Study Group, this is probably the most active, actually, group of teachers who engage in lesson study. Lesson study group at Mills College, this is probably more of the researchers group, but they also provide various resources to help various groups throughout the United States conduct lesson study. William Patterson University has a lesson study center where Makoto Yoshida is the director of the center. Makoto is one of the first person to introduce a lesson study in the United States. Here's the pictures from one of the public research lessons conducted in Chicago. And this teacher, I think this was a grade 6 lesson, so that's 12 years old. And they're looking at, you can probably guess what the problem is about, right? You see these hexagons putting together and basically looking at what happens to the perimeter. So it's really looking at developing the patterns and how to generalize. So the students working, they were given pattern blocks that they can work with. And you see some of the observers, part of the observers there. And then in this particular open house, it was school-based, but it was conducted as open house. So there are probably about 120 people came to observe the lesson. So instead of having the discussion as a whole group of 120, they organized the panel discussions. And this is the teacher who taught the lesson. These 3 teachers were part of the planning team. And they had some other people who, from the audience, as representing the audience, engaged in the really critical discussion of the lesson. I'm there, and I'm not nodding off. I was taking notes. Whoever took this picture, just timing was off. Right? Some people have asked me, why are you nodding off? No. Right. So it's been a little more than 10 years since the lesson studies introduced in the United States. And we've had some successes, but we also had many challenges. And I'm sure that some of these challenges that your colleagues that will be presenting tomorrow can relate to. But one of the things that always come up is the time. And sometimes they would argue, why are we spending so much time developing one lesson plan? And I didn't include this, but that's part of the challenges that we face in the United States. This is the misconception of the point or the purpose of lesson study. The purpose of lesson study isn't necessarily producing the perfect lesson plan. There's no such thing as the perfect lesson plan, because you're always working with different group of students. Your students different from your students. Even if you're working with your own students, the students you see today and the students you will see tomorrow are different because they learned something today. Right? You only see the students the way they are on that one particular moment, and you really need to take that seriously. So you cannot